Speaking of Ann's sister, Marilyn Weldon, she is still in the hospital at Centennial and expect to go home maybe today. Perfect timing with the weather. She wants to send a personal thank you for the flowers. They really did encourage her a lot, and that's a really great thing you do here in this class. We're at the part of James that's bringing up the topic of speech or communication once more, so I call this the mighty muscle, the tongue. Now, communication, as you all know, is not as easy as we mostly think it is. It's a pretty difficult skill, actually. I had experience with that this past week. I called one of these customer agency lines, customer help lines, and it seemed to me that it kind of went like this. Welcome to our line. We're sorry you called. Para español, marca número dos. Deutsche, 5. If you're sure you need any information today, press 1. If you need your account balance, press 2. If you're trying to weasel out of your payment, press 3. If you're a complete idiot, press 4. If you can't take a joke, press 5. To take a survey on how well I'm doing, press 6. Press 9 to repeat all the above. To talk to a live human being, press the 0 key. So I went and pressed 9 because I didn't know what the 0 key was. I thought maybe it had something to do with a masked adventurer with a sword. And then I went through it about 3 times, listening to all of that all over again, and finally I figured out what she was saying was this. The 0 key is the Zorro key. So I pressed the 0 key and was immediately disconnected. I'm telling you, it's a challenge, my friends, to try to communicate. If you got a problem, try to get it through. It's not easy. So James says that's because we don't pay enough attention to the mighty muscle. And we always want to get everybody to listen to us. We want attention. That's real important. We understand that. If you don't get attention much in life, you tend to feel very solitary, very isolated, very alone. So that's why they say a lot of kids act out. They want attention, so if they can't get it one way, they'll get it another. And that's what we're assured that will happen. So it may be true, I don't know. But you ever really try to get someone's attention? Not an easy thing to do. Here's how many a wife feels that she needs to do to be able to get her husband to listen to her. Nothing else seems to work. And oddly enough, if men read the paper, which they often do at breakfast, and you're saying a bunch of things to them as the wife, and you later, well, can you remember anything I've said? It's amazing how much they can repeat. It really is. They are obviously capable of multitasking, so give the men a break. But sometimes you feel like this is the only way. Now, don't think for a moment. You've got something to say. You've got something in your head that's important to you. You've got a set of ideas. Now, you got the job of translating that into language, getting that over to another person in a way they understand it and not misunderstand it. You got a formidable task on your hands, believe it or not. Now, James knows that, and so he's a little bit concerned about some of the attitudes that teachers in congregations are taking in his time. And so he wants to deal with that. Now, I call this communication. That's as good a word, I suppose, as any, and James takes a look at this mighty muscle to try to deal with it. The first thing I think we need to understand is that communication in James' time was a big deal. Probably some of the communication ideas of the ancient world are even more up to date than our ideas, strangely enough. Almost all speech textbooks that I've ever looked at, and I've looked at hundreds of them, I was on a review committee at the university and I had to read them, whether I liked it or not. It was amazing how many of them were based on the work of Aristotle, still today after all these years. Communication ideas were a very hot topic, and what many commentators feel, particularly Davies, Adams, and others who write on the Greek text of James, the problem that's going on in the congregation James is addressing is people want the prestige and the honor and the dignity of being a teacher, but they're not really qualified. They don't know anything about communication. They don't know how to get the message across. And not only that, they're a little ethically wrong, and they're also doctrinally wrong. They're going into teaching for the prestige and for the plaudits and the applause they get out of it, because it was a super dignified position at this particular time in Hellenistic culture. Okay, so it was very hot. Now, if you have nothing else to do, you might pick up a copy of Philostratus and Eunapius, who talk a lot about ancient education in Athens. I don't advise you to do that, it's rather boring. But they do say, they describe how people would come, say, to Athens, trying to find a teacher of rhetoric, because so much was promised by these people. So much was promised to you. If you could just get proficiency in the art of communicating, this would make your day. This would be like taking an online course and getting a doctorate overnight or something. It would be just really great, for you. Philostratus and Eunapius in the Lives of the Sophists talk about how when boats landed at Athens with prospective students, all the teachers had representatives down there to collar these students and say, "Hey, you want a good teacher? I'm going to tell you, I got a good teacher for you." And they drag these people to the teacher, make them sign a contract. It was a really huge professional kind of thing. Also, let's see, we're getting another line here. Communication of theory was also very diverse at this time and very seriously contested. So this is the world James lived in, and by his writing, I see he is familiar with all that's going on. So this is not something they were just living out here in the provinces and didn't have any idea. James, by his vocabulary and everything, is very conversant in Hellenistic Greek. So being so, then he's obviously in touch with all this struggle going on. We have people in the church buying into this idea of becoming a great teacher and getting all this renown and everything. Okay, let's take a look at some of the communication ideas of that time. First, I want to introduce you to Gorgias of Leontini in Sicily. When Gorgias came to Athens, he was so powerful that all the young people flocked to hear him. He's like a rock star almost, because they didn't have TV or anything like that, and the Beatles hadn't been discovered yet. And the Everly Brothers, I lost one of them last week, a terrible thing, good singers. There wasn't a lot of real popular entertainment, but rhetoricians or sophists were the hit people of the day. When in Gorgias hit town, all the young people of Athens flocked to hear him. Well, it really upset Socrates a lot, and you can read about that in the dialogue called the Gorgias. But here was the idea as Gorgias. So you're a young person, and he says to you, if you take my course, first of all, I'm going to teach you to speak in a way that's going to mesmerize your audience. You're going to have power over them. And one of the ways that Gorgias did this was using, if you pardon the technical term, antithetical speech. That is to say, it rhymed. So that he taught them to speak in a way that would just get you kind of in one of these moods, it's like rap music, really. It's kind of like after a while, you don't know where you are. And I have one example from one of his speeches. He wanted to say this, wishing to be enslaved, but instead of saying that in an ordinary way, he says, "Boulemenoi kai doulemenoi." You see how it all rhymes? And the whole speech is that way. Well, after a while, you're just kind of, everything rhymes. It's just like listening to an hour of jingles, It does things with your mind. And he said, you're going to have more power than you ever believed. He said even the gods themselves would see, the idea was that if you he said, we don't have anything like that today, but I just saw a book the other day in Goodwill. They had a half-price sale, so I could get a $1.99 book for $1. And it was How to Pray So God Will Listen. Well, you see, we got the same thing today. It goes back to Gorgias. Gorgias said, you can make such a wonderful speech, even God will listen to you. He'll be impressed. Wow, listen to that guy speak. Isn't he great? So Gorgias was promised that. Now, how he delivered that, I'm not really sure. But he believed that words were like, you could become like a wizard. And persuasion was like taking somebody hostage. You were to be that good and that powerful. You'd rule the community. You'd rule. And people bought into this. Well, did it really happen? Well, Socrates points out in a book called The Gorgias, no, it didn't happen. It was just all a bunch of baloney. But Gorgias made tons of money. He made a lot of drachmas out of this. On the opposite side was Aristotle. And Aristotle provided a needed corrective to this idea of rhetoric. Now, you understand all the debates going on, this pretty well represents the other side. Now, I think this is important. Rhetoric is a skill that can be mastered. It's not just a gift, okay? You can do it. If you go to court or something like that and it doesn't work out, you may not have done a good job. You need to look at yourself. If your students in Bible class are not doing well, you may be a bad teacher, in other words. Fact, now here's where Aristotle, is where the whole thing begins to work in the wrong way, in a way. Facts, truth, are often not enough. And because they're not enough, the mode of persuasion becomes critical or crucial. And it's always about probabilities, but now the mode then becomes more important. So this is where James' teachers are. They're more into the mode than into the facts. So that the way and what they're doing to get your attention and compel your attention is more about them than it is about you mastering the truth. And so Aristotle actually set that up early on in the rhetoric. Another thing he pointed out, which I think is kind of interesting, is you can clarify facts in a speech, but a lot of people don't do that. They manipulate ideas. And so one of the reasons you want to study speech, Aristotle said, is so you can understand when that's happening to you. When someone, and just the other day I was listening, this lady was on Channel 4, I think, and she said her mother had been called by one of these scam artists, and he said to her, "You have won $1 million, but to show your good faith, you need to send us $10,000. And she believed it. And she sent $10,000, cleaned out all her savings, and sent $10,000 to these scammers. Well, they gladly took the money. And her daughter was saying, "Mom, if you win something, you don't have to pay anybody. They pay you." And her mother says, she didn't get it. In other words, she had no capacity to understand that people would use speech to deceive you. Now, how you live that long without understanding that, I don't know. But that's kind of what's going on. Speech is being used to deceive people because they're paying more attention to the mode of it than they are to the ideas inside of it. And finally, Aristotle said, skill with weapons is important, but if you cannot present your ideas in public, you are not an educated person. In other words, it was crucial to be able. So this is kind of the world James lives in, all right. So what does he say? Well, remember how he starts out with this sort of idea? Well, I want to quote Virginia's satire because I think this is something you're familiar with already. But when you're born into the world, now, how many of you teachers have probably had to study some of the work of Virginia's satire? Have you? Nobody done that? Nobody? Okay. Well, one. Okay, well, that's good. Probably more, but you know how it is. It's Sunday, hands don't go above your waist normally, except to eat. Now, can she be right? I don't know. Maybe so. This is pretty important. All the things in your life, asking that girl to go on a date with you the first time, talking in class to your professor, relating to your parents, or you're relating to your children, everything involves communicating. And it doesn't matter whether you're a doctor or a lawyer, it can impact what you do. And even if you're a professor of the most esoteric subject you could possibly imagine, it's like Paul Ricoeur, the Frenchman, said, "My job is to teach, so I've got to learn how that can be done best." Now, here these guys had a job to teach, but they were misusing the whole idea of communication for their own glory. That's the problem. Okay. So, how hard is communication? Well, in a study done by Mary Ellen Guffey, who's a very famous business communication writer and researcher, she researched a lot of companies, and this is what she came up with. Number one, the board of directors issues a fiat, a ukase, an instruction of some kind, and they sat down in their meeting and they said, "We are 100% agreed on what this says, okay? We got all the," well, that I doubt, but they say that, okay. So maybe a church group gets together and they say, "We agree at the level of eldership, 100% on this is what we want to do." Okay, so it begins to be disseminated. So, in her study, the vice president understood 63% of what came down. And that's not bad. That's really good. In fact, it's astounding. The general supervisor understood 56%, so that wasn't too bad. The plant manager understood 40% of what was being said. In all these cases, the team leaders understood 30%, and the guys and the gals that are going to do the work that are going to implement all of this, how much did they understand? According to the study, 20%. Now, we wonder how things get fouled up, right? And you can check a lot of research that's been done in this area. And so it takes more than you can possibly imagine to carry out what information needs to be conveyed. Now, that's true not only in Bible class, but in relationships of every kind. We just assume because we said it, people are going to understand it. Not so. So, James is going to try to help us out here. Now, first of all, he said this, and I want to run it by you one more time. This is where he started, and he picks his topic back up. But he comes back to it after he says, now, first of all, he says, when you teach or you speak or you communicate, be more of a listener than you are a speaker. Listen to what people are saying. Now, he warns us that reactionism is the killer of communication. Reactionism, just reacting without thinking, without trying to understand, without trying to clarify, is the enemy of all communication. So because the goals of effective communication are to be able to think rather than react, it's amazing how many people react without thinking. You know how that is. It leads to road rage and everything else, right? We just assume this person, I've got to teach him how to be a good driver. Or the store clerk may be a little distracted. Maybe she didn't feel well. This person doesn't care about me. I'm going to really never come back here again. I'm going to vote with my feet. You can keep your stupid merchandise. We react. The wife says something, we misinterpret it, we jump all over her. She said, I didn't mean it that way. Well, bluster, of course, carries the day. Now, to facilitate understanding behavior, you got to start asking a few questions. You got to start understanding, what do you mean by that? Would you clarify that for me? Give me an example. Anything you have to do, that's not going on. Okay. Of course, put the problem in context, and the way you'll ever do that is with good communication skills. And finally, you'd like to generate a few new options. How many of you in a relationship, and don't raise your hands, where you'd like to generate a few options for new behavior? Well, I see by the smile on your face that you're barely holding your hand down. Okay, so that's possible through communication, and that's what James hoped will happen. But there's a lot of reactivity, and he's disturbed by that. Well, the bad thing about reactivity that James tells us to avoid it is because it creates an extreme field of anxiety. Now we're on the spot, and we got to explain things, and we've got to justify our existence almost, it seems. So that makes us over-focus on the response the other person's getting rather than how we may act to diffuse the situation. And what happens? We all get stuck. And when you get stuck, it's just like the tar baby thing, and Brer Rabbit, Gopher, that's not no good. You get stuck. People get stuck in relationships at a certain point and don't even understand they can get out of that. But they got to stop reaction and stop reacting and begin understanding and beginning to clarify and beginning to work on new options. It can be done. James knows that, and he's disturbed by how they're getting stuck in this kind of firing back and forth at each other, this controversial field of action. Okay. So reactivity is a bad thing. All right. So let's move on. It's the enemy of communication, obviously. All right. So where do we go from here? Well, when James gets down to chapter 3, he immediately provides a nightmare for every church educational director. And you believe that he actually says this. So if I'm a church educational director, you know what I'm going to say? This is Plankton, by the way, in case you're not familiar with him, but he's a perfect protest agent. He's always protesting something or trying to take over the world, one or the other. James, you're going to wreck our teacher recruiting. You say, I love the way the King James says, be not many masters. Isn't that great? I love that. But, it meant something back then. A master was a teacher back then. Okay. You trying to Now, what James is really trying to do is not that. He's trying to stop people who are not qualified, who are going into it only for their own glory, who have no intention of helping anyone out. He wants to kind of screen out those type of people, you see. Because, you see what I'm saying? being a teacher in the ancient world was a huge position of prestige, whether it was in the Jewish community, the Hellenistic community, or even now it seems in the Christian community. So you could get almost instant prestige by doing this. You could even have a card printed out in Greek. I am a teacher at such and such a church. You know. And people would say, oh, wow, you're a really cool guy. You know, it'd be like having a vanity plate of some kind, you know, saying how great you are. And so anyway. No, he's not trying to wreck it, Plankton, but now take a look at the passage and you can see what he's going for. First of all, you don't want to jump into something you're not qualified for because you really won't pass the test. I'm amazed when I read about these guys who fake being brain surgeons and everything, you know, and get away with it. How is that possible? Or airplane pilot. I wonder why don't they ever write the book about the guys that tried to do that and crashed and killed everybody? Or the brain surgeon guy who amputated a head instead of doing anything on your brain. You know, why we always read about this one guy, you know, and they even made a movie about it. But notice what James says. I want to tell you how hard communication is, my friends. You may think that you're a pretty good guy, and you may be very successful in many walks of life, and you may look good and make good chili. You may, bring you in here, Larry. You may, be sing like a bird, you may throw the javelin for records, but if you don't control your tongue, James says, that shows you are so far from being what you ought to be. Now, we don't look at it that way. You know, in church, for example, a few years back, there was this big movement to discipline people. A guy made a living going around for a couple of years. Churches need to discipline more, we're not disciplined. And so they would look, after he'd leave, they'd spent money on the guy. Who can we discipline? Which is a lot like giving a kid a BB gun on Christmas, you know? Because if you give a kid a BB gun on, not only do they shoot their eye out, but they look for targets, right? Your cat, your vase, your lamp, your bay window, your grandmother, whatever, you know, a target. Well, so what's happening here is that we got something like that going on, you see, is that these people don't understand that this is really out of control here. And James is sort of saying, look, this is far more important than you realize. This is kind of what we're all about, communicating. A great idea from God, the good news. And when you start getting in the way, you don't believe. It's unbelievable how much you're messing up. So you really would be. James would say, this is very important. Now, say you take a church like this discipline guy I was telling you about, people to be disciplined who would listen. Let's discipline everybody who's not attending. Well, that's great. First of all, how do you disfellowship somebody that you have no fellowship with? I mean, the whole thing was just ridiculous. But nobody ever said, let's discipline the people that are harming others with their tongue, that are hurting other people, that are teaching things that are really painful and divisive and cruel and mean. And yet James would have said, take those guys on first. They're the ones that are causing almost all your problems. These divisive people, he's going to come back to this later, okay. But notice what he says. First of all, he says there's about a horse. Let's think of a horse. Okay, you got a big old horse. I'm not a horse person. I know that they're nice. I know they can really, be hard to tame sometime. But even a thoroughbred needs training, right? Don't you agree? So even if you're the best, you still need some guidance. Accept the fact you need some guidance, that you need some input, you need some information. You're not that great on your own, okay. So even thoroughbreds, James says, now like a horse, there's just a really small thing that's involved in training the horse, and it's called a bit. I'm not into all of this very much, but I know that if you're a person that rides horses a lot, that you'd have a difficult time unless you had some way of controlling. So think of yourself as a powerful person. And yet your impact on how much good you can do depends on your ability to communicate. Just like the horse's ability to perform and to serve depends on being able to be controlled. And if you can't control your tongue and you're always blowing everybody out, and if you're saying something like this, well, that's just the way I am, that'd be like some horse feeling like it was perfectly okay to come in this chapel right now and trample every one of you to death. Because, that's what horses do. But horses don't do that. They're trained. And so we need to put our tongue in a position to do that. So he goes on. And when you get your horse trained, you do all kinds of amazing things, like charge across the desert in formation. That's pretty neat. Well, that took some work to do, don't you think? I mean, just think, we can't work together in concert unless we're communicating. See, that's the idea. You can't do anything unless you have communication with the group. All right. Then he uses the illustration of the ship. And what he sort of says is, a shipwreck is ahead if you don't pay attention to how the guy that's steering the ship is doing. So he has this story. Okay, so ships, huge. Now, back in the end, you say, oh, we got bigger ships. Well, sure, I know. But, think back to the times. How big a ship must have looked to people back then. A big old ship, with sails on it and everything, and driven by powerful winds. And yet he says, there's just one little part that makes it all possible, and that's the rudder. Now, the interesting thing is, in Greek, the helmsman, the word translated helmsman, sometimes translated pilot, is really based on the Greek word to make things straight. And so, in the form, it means the make it straight guy, okay? It reminds me a little bit of Star Trek, where Captain Picard says, make it so. Hey, that was pretty good. That sounded just like him, didn't it? Make it so, number one. So it's like this guy's supposed to make it so because he's got control. But yet imagine this big, powerful ship, and it's out there sailing along in calm water, no problem, right? But what happens when you hit a storm? This guy better know what he's doing. So when you hit crises in your life and you have no idea how to control your communication, and you're going to wreck. And that's why so many relationships wreck. The person that's supposed to provide, make it straight, has no clue on how to steer that thing, that relationship, or that church, or that class, or whatever. James says, you've got to realize the power of these things to go wrong. Okay. So then he moves on to another illustration, and, here's my final guy that he's never going to learn anything, so he says what? It's all about me. All right, that's a shipwreck in advance. You run into somebody like this, it's a shipwreck, okay? Stay away. I read a book not long ago called Maybe He's Just a Jerk. And the idea was, if a person keeps talking and communicating in a way that indicates he's a jerk, maybe he is a jerk. And you're not going to change him, okay? All right. So now I get the fire illustration. This is a pretty good one because everybody can relate to that. Who hasn't been out camping in the woods and said, no, we got to be careful to put this fire out because even if you don't think it's out, and there's even a little cold, you just never know what, and we're all real careful about it, but there's some people that aren't careful about it at all. It's like this Allstate commercial where the goofy guy has the fire that he leaves on after the tailgating party and everything blows up and, people are, and then he has the lighter fluid in the car too, real smart, the guy says, chaos, what he calls himself, mayhem, that's it. Mayhem, right, way to go, all right. They communicated to you. See how vast a forest fire is set ablaze by a tiny spark. Doesn't take much, does it? Doesn't take much to burn down acres and acres and acres and acres of beautiful forest. Doesn't take much to get it started. Doesn't take much. Did you hear about Susie? No. What about, well, it's said by some pretty reliable people. Where's that going to go? No place good. Going to be a lot of damage done there, a lot of harm. Suppose you've got teachers that are actually impacting people in negative ways like that. It's going to spread. It's going to get worse. It's not going to get any better. Or maybe, you just have one little match, and that's all you need. All you need to set it off. And then what you got? Conflagration. In other words, what James is talking about here is the destructive power of misguided communication, of mean and thoughtless and even vicious things that people say. And so a great deal of damage is done. Now, notice how James describes it. What you're really doing is all these things have been given to you to bless others with. And yet you're changing them to blessing. And he says, you know what it is? It's just a case of arson. And you know where this arson comes from, he says? Well, read the chapter. It comes from hell. It's set on fire by hell itself, he says. Hell itself. Everything evil and demonic that is concerned with breaking up all the joy and the possibilities we have in human and divine human relationships will be destroyed by willfully distorted communication. So, I like to put up 3 red lights. Now, first of this was the horse. Power, but if it isn't control, you have power, enormous power in yourself. But the tongue, the communication, the way you communicate will help you effectuate that power. The ship, very useful, does great work, but if it has no direction, it's just a wreck. Same thing with you, same thing with me. If I have no sense of direction, if I have no clarity at all in what I'm doing with my life, I'm just a wreck. That's what's going to happen. And finally, great benefit of fire. You cannot imagine life without the power of heat and fire. So much we could talk about that's great. And yet, at the same time, neglected, treated carelessly, treated recklessly, enormous destruction. 3 areas, James says, we need to look at about our communication life. So Christian teachers then, to sum it up, so to speak, desire only the Lord. Now, that's what Russ did a good job of that today. Somebody might say back and say, well, look at Donelson, they're bragging about themselves. No, look what the Lord's enabled us to do. So we only desire the Lord's prayer. We're not in competition with one another. Lighthouses are not in competition, remember. They're all trying to do the same job. We should rejoice in the talents of others. It's a funny thing in the church. People, they mean well, but through the years, people will say, sometimes a visiting speaker will come in, they'll come up and say, better watch your job. Like we're all in competition, and like he's Nick Saban and I'm, the other guy, and we don't like each other, and we don't want you to win. I don't want you to win. I know some football fans are so fanatic. They are actually happier when the team they hate loses than they are when the team they love wins. Isn't that weird? Where does that all come from? Can't you enjoy some talent somebody has, even if you don't have to dislike them? Somebody says, so-and-so is a great teacher. We should say, thank God. We need more great teachers here. That's what we should say. So let's support and encourage fellow teachers rather than be in competition with them. So Christian teachers, number 1, I think, inspire enthusiasm. It's kind of like Benjamin Zonder says, who goes around doing all these seminars. He says, I am here to help you be enthusiastic. Wow, what a difference there is when you're an enthusiastic teacher. They don't discourage anyone, but encourage. And I saw a lady in the hospital the other day. She was doing pretty good, and somebody came in. It was kind of like one of these visits, that you don't need. Well, I see you've got advanced scleroma of the head. In other words, your head's too hard. My Aunt Myrtle had the same thing, and she didn't last a month. What a great visit. Okay. You need to earn trust, and the only way you ever earn trust in teaching or anything else in communication is you got to care. If you don't care, you'll never earn trust. Make the world a better place. That's what we're called on to do, James says, as teachers, to make the world a better place. And finally, put it up on the wall. What have I done today to make the world a better place? That's what James hopes he gets out of his teachers. They'll stop all this competitive nonsense and understand they have great power to guide, great power to encourage, great power. But yet, like the ship and the horse and the fire, it's all being misused for the wrong reasons. It becomes all about them. It's not all about us, friends. It's about the Lord. And we got to recognize that, and I think the Lord will help us in our communication, whether it's in relationships or whether it's in this kind of setting or whatever it is, at business, at work. This is not an easy task, trust me, but it is a worthwhile one. It will bless your life more than you could possibly imagine if you begin making changes in this area.